Welcome everybody to today's 2019 federal election webinar series. This is the second last in our series today. Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which all participants of this webinar stand and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today we'll be hearing from Ann Sanson. Ann is a developmental psychologist and Honorary Professorial Fellow at the University of Melbourne. Ann's expertise covers social and emotional development in childhood and adolescence. Her current work focuses on the impact of the climate crisis on children and how we as adults can best support them to ensure their well-being. Ann sees a critical role for professionals working with young people to address their concerns about the future and to influence policy to improve that future. Ann is a Fellow of the Australian Psychological Society and the International Society for the Study of Behavioural Development. We're really privileged to have Ann with us today, and I'd like to hand over to Ann now. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to Aracy too for giving me this opportunity to talk about what I think is a really critical issue for all of us who are working with and for children and young people in the context of this coming election. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I think it's worth thinking about the way the climate crisis is going to impact on the land that they've cared for many tens of thousands of years, and also on the lifestyles of Indigenous people, particularly those in remote communities in low-lying islands. So my main research career has been around looking at children's social and emotional and cognitive development in the context of in the context of their families, their communities and their broader environment, largely through longitudinal studies. So the longest lasting study has been the Australian Temperament Project, which we began in 1983 with 2,500 Victorian infants, and that's now in its 36th year. So we're now it's now a 3-generation project, one of the largest 3-generation projects in the world. And the other study that I've had the pleasure of being involved in is Growing Up in Australia, the longitudinal study of Australian children, where I was the initial project director, and I've continued to be involved. And that we're up to wave 8 in that study now. So I guess with both these studies, we're really trying to understand what are the processes, the contexts, the factors that lead to children doing well, or alternatively lead to problems. And we've looked at a whole range of problems, from anxiety and depression to antisocial behaviour and substance use, risky driving, a whole range of different things. But particularly in the Australian Temperament Project in recent years, we've been really interested in what are the predictors of positive development, what are the factors that lead to kids doing well in life, and how does that impact later on in their adulthood. But as I've come to the end of my formal career, I've more and more found myself wondering how much of what we've been trying to do about understanding what leads to kids thriving and what leads to problem outcomes and what leads to resilience and breaking of those paths between early problems and later outcomes, how much of that is going to be relevant in the context of climate change, because that really is going to change every aspect of their context. Because, as they say, the climate is everything. It's the planetary stage on which all human drama takes place, and it affects every aspect of kids' lives. So you know, the impacts on the next generation are going to be dramatic and catastrophic unless we act now. So what I'm hoping to do today is take you a little bit on the journey of where my thinking and listening and reading has taken me, and some ideas about how we as people who are working with and for young people can together help address this really unprecedented challenge. So the first thing is really that all we have to do is to look around us now to see that the earth is already too hot. We're having unprecedented floods and storm surges. Already whole villages and whole island communities are having to leave the land on which they've lived for generations and to find somewhere else to go. We've seen these terrible intense bushfires in Australia, the awful ones in the southwest of Tasmania, killing Gondwana land era forests forever, the ones in California, in Spain, all over the place. We're seeing hundreds of thousands of people already having to leave their homes because of drought in Northern Africa and the Middle East. And we've seen what the impact of that migration into Europe is already having on politics there. And of course, we're having the sadness of watching the bleaching of our beloved Great Barrier Reef. And more, thinking about the environment more broadly, we're now in the midst of the 6th global extinction event. We're losing plants and animals at 1,000 times the background rate. And this is all with only 1 degree of warming so far. So to me, thinking about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees of warming being the safe limit just doesn't make sense. We're already seeing really dramatic changes. This is the famous Keeling curve coming from an observatory in Hawaii that takes measures of concentration of carbon dioxide concentrations continuously. And this shows the upward drift from 1960 onwards. So if you look over a longer time span from over a million years, you see the levels of carbon dioxide fluctuating, but they never got above 300 parts per million until around about the time when the Titanic sank. So, you know, maybe 100 years into the Industrial Revolution. And since then, it's been this continuous curve. Scientists at that stage, when we got over 300, thought that 350 parts per million would be the safe limit. We passed that limit in the 1980s, 1990s. We crossed 400 parts per million in 2013. I checked what the reading was in January for a talk I was giving then, and it was to 411 parts per million. I checked again a couple of weeks ago, and we're now at nearly 414 parts per million. So I think that shows that everything that we are doing so far is nothing like enough. The levels of carbon dioxide are still going up inexorably and into dangerous ranges. So what are people saying about this? We think about the Paris Agreement signed by 195 countries around the world. They talk about the urgent and potentially irreversible threat posed by climate change for human societies and the planet. If we look at UNICEF, our United Nations organization working with children, describing it as the most significant intergenerational challenge facing the world today. If we look at what The Lancet, our premier medical journal, says, it describes it as the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. If we see what Obama said, he said good things even if he didn't do much. He talks about climate change. He points out that we're the first generation to feel the effects of climate change, but the last generation that can do something about it. And then the Pope, in his encyclical a few years ago, said the problem isn't just how it's going to impact upon our children and our grandchildren, but beyond that, whether civilization as we know it can be extended beyond the next 1,000 years. So really, it's, you know, all these experts are telling us we are in an unprecedented emergency situation. And in fact, scientists have needed to create a new risk category. So this graph is pretty hard to explain, but the green part is we're staying in the safe zone. Staying in that, the probability of being in a safe climate really requires us to be drawing now on 3 levers, which means a rapid transition to zero carbon emissions, massive drawdown of the short-lived greenhouse gases like methane and hydrofluorocarbons and black soot, and also drawing down about 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide, about half of what we've put into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. That's to stay in the safe zone. If we act more slowly, then we move into the dangerous level and then into the catastrophic level. But if we act at about the speed we are doing now, then we are really into this existential threat category. And existential means the death of billions of people and the likely collapse of human civilization. and the breakdown of much of our whole ecosystem in terms of the natural world. So it's pretty scary stuff. So I think there's no escaping the fact that we are facing a climate emergency. This is a new situation we're in. We never have had to before. And I think we do now know all this despite the concerted efforts of a very few but very powerful people who have sought to put doubt in our minds about the reality of climate change, and now putting doubt in our minds about the urgency. So we still hear talk about market forces can fix this, or that we'll come up with fancy new technologies like, you know, geoengineering, which will fix it, which are really unrealistic given the timeframes that we have. So how then is global warming or the climate crisis impacting on children and young people? This graph comes from a really good publication that I recommend you get hold of. It's a little bit old now, by Susan Clayton and her colleagues for the American Psychological Association, where they're summarizing the psychological impacts of climate change. I won't go through this in detail, but in the middle here you can see the physical impacts, the things I've already talked about of wildfires, sea level rising, changing growing seasons and so on. How that then impacts on human systems and infrastructure, the widespread destruction of both urban and rural infrastructure, breakdown of transportation networks, with increasing temperature and decreasing changes in rainfall patterns. Food production goes down, so food insecurity is likely to increase. The impact on services, human services. Just think about, for example, the insurance industry, and it's already under challenge from the number of droughts and bushfires and flooding events and so on that we have experienced. When those increase, the stressors on the insurance industry are going to be massive, and that's being recognised within the industry. Think also of, closer to home for us, about health services and the stress that they're put under even with a single extreme weather event related to climate change, of a bushfire or a drought or floods or whatever. When these accumulate and become more pervasive, the stresses on our health services, both physical and mental health services, are going to be significant. And then there's a lot of discussion now by the defence services, defence industry, about the impacts on human security. Then if we look at community health impacts, we know that with increasing temperature, there's a really interesting meta-analysis that has looked across continents and across centuries and documented how, with an increase in temperature and a decrease in rainfall, there's an increase in all forms of violence, interpersonal, intergroup, and interstate, but in particular intergroup conflict. We know after Hurricane Katrina, the amount of domestic violence went up. After our Black Saturday bushfires here in Victoria, the amount of family violence also was documented to increase. And the decreases in the sense of continuity, of cohesion, as more people are on the move, internally and across borders, as they're coping with changed environments. It's all fairly self-evident about the increases in instability and decreases in cohesion that we can expect. In terms of physical health impacts and mental health impacts, I'll go on now to talk more specifically, because this report was about people in general, and now go on to focus particularly on kids. So what do we know about the physical health impacts? The first thing to note is that children are more vulnerable to climate change impacts than adults, largely because they are kids. So because of their early rapid growth, their immature biological systems, because of the way they make contact with the physical environment in a much more direct way, so they have greater exposure to allergens and toxins and bacteria and so on. Because they're dependent on adults, so if adults are either unavailable or highly stressed, kids are put at more risk. And then, of course, they're going to have this exposure to stressful life events accumulating over their whole lifetimes. and we know what the impact of stressful life event, an accumulation of stressful life events is on child well-being. So the documented threats to physical health include just the direct fatalities and injuries through extreme weather events, but also increases in infectious air, food and waterborne diseases and heat-related illnesses. So we're already seeing the increase in the range of dengue fever and malaria and things like that. And then malnutrition and diarrheal diseases that are already the major killers of kids in certainly in the developing world, and are likely to increase more, or are known to increase more with climate change events. So the World Health Organization estimates that 80% of the fatalities, injuries and illnesses due to climate change impacts will fall on the shoulders of children. And then if we think about mental health impacts, there are those that are clearly documented from climate-related events, like an increase in PTSD, in depression and anxiety disorders, sleep disorders, and cognitive deficits and learning problems, both from disruptions in education, but also through malnutrition and illness and so on. But perhaps even more significant is the indirect or vicarious experience of climate change, which is the case for most of our kids in Australia at the moment. So most kids know about climate change and most kids are worried about it. Surveys are usually around about 70 or 80%. I suspect if we had a survey now with the increased awareness, it would be higher still. So they express distress, grief and feelings of loss, fear and anxiety, anger and frustration with our generation for having put them in this pretty pickle, helplessness and despair and hopelessness. So most of the data we have now comes from wide-scale surveys, and if you just add in a question about how worried are you about climate change, in the context of how worried are you about whether you'll get a job or whether your parents will divorce or die or your appearance or whatever, climate change tends to be rated somewhat more low in the level of their concerns through a sort of priming effect. But with a few studies that have done in-depth interviews or have been focused specifically on the environment, the rates of concern that are expressed are much, much higher. And so one study, for example, in Denver, in and around Denver, with 10 to 12-year-olds, they found that 82% of the kids that they interviewed were expressing deep feelings of fear, anxiety, distress, helplessness, hopelessness, or what they described as eco-anxiety. So I think we need to be aware that even if kids aren't expressing this all the time, this is an underlying concern that they're having. This is a graph from a terrific publication by UNICEF called Unless We Act Now. And it really shows just how climate change events will exacerbate existing inequalities. This particular graph is in relation to drought, but they go through all climate-related events doing a similar analysis. And it shows how kids from wealthier families, even though they might suffer in a drought, they might suffer a lot of material deprivation, lose a lot of things, the families still can migrate more safely. And even when food prices escalate, they can still afford to buy food and they can more easily access clean water. Even when healthcare services are stretched, they will be more able to receive healthcare, more likely to protect themselves from the heat, and more likely to have a range of other coping things like being able to maintain the children in education. So you can expect a relatively speedy recovery for those kids in those circumstances from a particular climate change event. But kids in poorer families find themselves in this escalating downwards pathway of an accumulation of deprivations because they can't migrate, they have poorer nutrition, they have disrupted education, and so on and so forth. And this of course applies to poorer kids within our wealthy countries, our weird countries, Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies like Australia, but it also applies to kids, poorer children in the developing world, which is where 85% of children live. So it becomes the intergenerational injustice, which is climate change, is compounded by these increased inequalities as another form of injustice. So how then, given that if we have to accept that we are facing a climate emergency, what can be done about it? Our scientists tell us really that we have about 10 years to not only stop the increase in carbon dioxide, but also to be starting on the drawing down process. So what really needs to happen? Well, I think we know where greenhouse gases come from. Largely from our use of fossil fuels. I don't know if you can read this image on your screens, but largely from our use of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. Also from our agricultural practices, particularly things like crop burning and cows and the methane that they release, and also from deforestation and so on as well as these really scary feedback loops that are emerging now, like the huge amount of methane that is released when the permafrost thaws. And there are other scary feedback loops too. So what needs to change then, both globally and nationally and locally? Basically, we need to stop using fossil fuels. We need to rapidly shift to renewable energy. We need to shift away from cars to public transport. We need to shift rapidly to electric cars. We need to radically change our agricultural practices, change our diets to more plant-based diets. We need to, and using more locally produced food. We need to stop coal mining. We need to stop flying off to Canberra for meetings in Canberra or yet another conference at the drop of a hat, which is why it's fantastic that RACI is using these webinars as a way of us being able to communicate with each other without having to fly. And we need to buy less stuff altogether. In other words, we need radical changes at a policy level, at a broad scale level of how we, of a whole system of production, as well as in our own lifestyles. It's major change. But we do, it is really important to remember that we do have the solutions to all of this, both to stop carbon emissions. We know about renewable energy and the options we have there, transforming our transport systems, changing our agricultural practices, moving to regenerative farming and so on. And we also know how to draw down excess carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere through things like forest restoration, regenerative farming, urban design, and so on. This book, Drawdown, by Paul Hawken, is a terrific book where they did very systematic analysis of all the drawdown technologies that were available and basically doing a cost-benefit analysis and an effectiveness analysis and listing the 100 most effective drawdown technologies we have. There are all the other fancy, technologically sophisticated ones like geoengineering, which would be massively expensive, and we don't really understand what the side effects would be. But there's lots of stuff around right now that we can use. So really all that is lacking is the political will for urgent action. And in democracies like Australia, we know that political will is driven by citizen demands. But despite the fact that most people these days are acknowledging that climate change is a problem that needs urgent changes in human behaviour and in policies, far fewer people are taking active steps to mitigate it. So what then might be our role as professionals with a commitment to the next generation and to improving child and youth well-being? Well, one thing I think is that we can't protect the next generation from catastrophic climate impacts that will occur if we don't act extremely fast as a nation and as a planet. So I would argue that our major and urgent role is to work for speedy political action. Democracy only works when the polis, that's us, the citizens, are actively engaged. And there are other things we can do too, which I will talk about later, about how we can support our kids and families. But if there isn't a livable planet for them, really those other things become somewhat irrelevant. So this one thing we can do, where we can speak with conviction and authority about the devastating impacts on current and future generations of young people. So I think we need to break the collective silence and talk openly about the climate emergency. So my local climate group has produced, mainly authored by Jane Morton, a fellow psychologist, has produced this booklet called Don't Mention the Emergency, in response to the common view that we shouldn't scare people. But Jane goes through the public health research, like this meta-analysis of 127 studies, which showed quite clearly that if you pair a high threat message with a high efficacy message, there's a problem, but there's something you can do about it, then it works. So that study concluded that fear appeals are effective at positively influencing attitudes, intentions, and behaviours, and there are no identified circumstances under which they backfire or lead to undesirable outcomes. So, you know, Australia led the world in the AIDS campaign by using these very graphic images of the Grim Reaper saying AIDS can kill you and sharing needles can kill you, so don't share needles. There's something you can do about it. Again, with smoking. Smoking causes lung cancer and can kill you, but there's something you can do about it. We can help you quit. And if there is a natural disaster, we have no hesitancy about saying it like it is. We say, there's a bushfire approaching, leave by the back road now. So this booklet ends up with a series of the sort of messages that we need to, high threat messages that we need to be using. Saying openly, the earth is already too hot. The damage we're doing, we won't be able to recover from. We have very little time left to act. And people and the natural world are both in danger. And what we're risking is really the collapse of human civilization. But to pair that always with high efficacy messages, there are things we can do. We need to move into emergency mode. We need a society-wide mobilization. And we have seen that. One of the clearest examples of that is in the US when it entered the Second World War. And in a matter of months or a year, they transformed their whole economy to a wartime footing. It just shifted huge numbers of people, shifted a huge numbers of industry towards the war effort. Now, we might not want it to be around a war effort, but it does show that we can do society-wide mobilizations fast. That we need to not just move to zero emissions, but we have to be drawing down as well, and that we can build a better world, that we have examples, draw on those examples. Political changes can happen very fast with a build up to a tipping point, and then suddenly we see fast change. You can think about women's suffrage, you can think about slavery, you can think about a whole lot of things. So I think that we do need to be just speaking out fast. So what can we within our organisations do? I think one really useful thing is to develop position statements using our expertise and credibility about child and youth development to write really authoritative position papers, which can then be very effective lobbying tools, outlining the need for urgent action, both on mitigation as well as adaptation for coping with the climate effects that we're inevitably going to see. I think that in all our conferences, we really need to put it up there as being a really central thing, not let it be the elephant in the room, but make sure that all our conferences and meetings we are addressing in a highly visible way the challenge of the climate crisis. And then in all our teaching and training things, talk about what the implications of climate change are going to be. Not only that, you know, kids there'll be new industries, new ways of work, new ways of organising that for the next generation. And so a lot of need for adaptation, but also the need for this really speedy mitigation and addressing the crisis if there's going to be a future for our kids. I think it's really useful to develop in-house climate change policies because that opens up conversations within your workplace. And those can be about, you know, all the things that sort of consumer-driven things about reductions in our carbon footprint, putting up the solar panels, reducing the use of paper, et cetera, And those are all really good, and they're good because they raise the consciousness about the issue. But we also need to be having the more political, the more citizen-based actions like divesting funds from fossil fuel industries and banks and so on that support fossil fuel industries. What else can we do as individuals and within our organisations? I think it's important to acknowledge and address the psychological factors that underlie the inaction that so many people still are not really taking action on this as they should. It's getting harder and harder, I think, for people to see climate change as distant in time and space, but we need to keep on reiterating that it's here now and for sure, and it's a crisis and we must be addressing it. Becoming desensitised to the problem. There's yet another bushfire, there's yet another broken record in terms of temperature, there's yet another drought. So helping people recognise this accumulation of what's going on and feeling like there's something they can do about it. People resist change because it seems to challenge their values. But I think, again, us as people who work with children and young people are in a very strong position to draw on that very common underlying value about protecting the next generation, to say this is relevant to you and it's in accordance with the knowledges, the values that you hold dear. And then the desire to avoid distressing feelings aroused by thinking about climate change. Those feelings are very, very real, and I think we need to be helping people at finding ways of managing those feelings. Feeling powerless, what can one person do? I think, again, we can raise awareness of how individual actions all lead into collective actions and do make a difference. And then for some people, of course, there is the short-term self-interest in maintaining the status quo. We can challenge that also in terms of saying, well, that's only going to be for the short term. It's not going to be in your interests later on. So my colleagues at the Australian Psychological Society, with input from some others of us, have developed this model which summarises ways in which we can stimulate action both within ourselves and with other people. We've summarised it into this model called Activate. I'm not going to go through this in detail now, but the A stands for acknowledging feelings. It's a really important aspect of this, of acknowledging both your own feelings and other people's feelings, and helping to find ways of managing those so you can deal with them and still address the problem. Creating social norms, making it normal to be green, normal to be taking action on climate change, talking about it, I've already talked about. Really important to inspire positive visions, to recognise that actually addressing climate change can lead to a much more just, more equal, more healthy world. V is value it, which I've already talked about a bit. Act is act now. The T is for time is now, and E is engage with nature, not only as to remind yourself about what it is part of what it is that you're fighting to protect, but also to rejuvenate yourself as well. So I can give you a link to both a two-pager on this as well as the Climate Empowerment Handbook, which goes into much more of the background in all of this, if you're interested. So really what we're trying to do there is to build collective efficacy. The big fish might get the little fish if we act individually, but if the little fish all gang up together, we can tackle the big fish. I think another thing that we can do is to support parents. What we found is that a lot of parents are really worried and confused about how to support their kids in the context of the climate crisis. So again, with my colleagues at the Australian Psychological Society, Susie Burke in particular, we've produced these resources to support parents, both in how to talk to their kids, how to manage their own feelings and their kids' feelings, and engaging them in action. The second one on the right, Raising Children, builds on the work that I've done with my colleagues in the Australian Temperament Project on positive development and coping, and it considers the skills and attributes that kids will need to adapt to the inevitable changes that are going to come, even if we, got to zero emissions tomorrow. There still is going to be a period of time of disrupted climate with uncomfortable things for our kids to deal with. but also that adaptation to a zero climate world where every aspect of lifestyles are going to have to change. So we've tried to look at that, and I'll say a few more words about that as we go along. But we are now being asked to provide workshops for parents on these issues, and I'm sure that others of you who are working in this area will find that many parents would welcome similar support, and I'm happy to help if I can with this. And the link there to these resources is on the bottom of this screen. The level of concern among parents now is really quite high. This is, I have to say, this is not a random survey. This was done by the ACF and the 1 Million Women Project. So it's not a random sample, but nevertheless, I think the figures that they came up with are really worrisome. So 33% of women under 30 were reconsidering having kids because of their fears about how climate change would impact on them. 22% in the 30 to 39-year age group were thinking the same, and 49% of the 30 to 39-year-old women did have children or were planning to, but were still worried about how it would impact on their kids. I think it's extraordinary. So I think it's finding ways to be honest but not overburdening kids is a challenge, I think, for many parents. And we found that it's helpful to say things like, yes, I'm scared too. It's quite reasonable to feel scared, but I'm doing everything I can to try to make sure that you stay safe and have a safe and healthy planet to live on. Let's think of some things we can do together to help stop climate change. So the headings in our guide for parents are shown here. I don't know that I'll go through these now. When do I know? Well, very briefly, when do I know my kids are ready to hear about climate change? We find that most kids know much more than their parents think they know about. What do I say to them? We go through the ideas about how to approach it for kids of different ages, from preschool age through to adolescence. How do I encourage them to care about nature and the environment, which we know is really important for pro-environmental values and being motivated to work to save the planet? How do I respond to their feelings and manage my own feelings at the same time with authenticity? That's a real challenge for many parents. How do I engage other parents? What can I do with my kids? And I think that's another really important one where we keep on being encouraged to act as consumers. If we stop using plastic bags, if we do some recycling and we have a compost bin, we can solve the problem, and it's our problem. You know, we caused it and we can solve it as individuals. And that sort of neoliberal bias comes through all the time. But it's really important to think about the more impactful things, which is really of us acting as citizens and acting to change policies and practices at a broader level. So what else can we do? Well, I think we need to be thinking about supporting our children and youth. And that starts off with acknowledging their concerns, of actually asking what they know, how they feel, listening, taking them seriously, building self-efficacy and collective efficacy. So I'm always saying action is the best antidote to anxiety. So if you're anxious, doing something about the cause of your anxiety is the best way of dealing with it. Sharing examples of how people working together have solved problems in the past. Really important to be treating them as active agents and as protagonists for change, not just as victims. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And I'll also come back to the importance of building these active citizenship skills. So this is what we've thought of as the attributes and competencies that kids are going to need in order to adapt to climate impacts and the transition to zero carbon, grouped here as individual, interpersonal, and social and civic. So self-regulation in order to manage the feelings and be able to cope with them. I think really important to promote the development of eudaimonic values, so the bigger than self values. This comes from Aristotle, talking about a meaningful life being a life of purpose, rather than just a hedonistic, which is what Plato talked about, of happiness and life satisfaction. So really building the values of social justice and equity and pro-environmental ones. Adaptability and resilience, obviously. Self-esteem and self-efficacy will also be straightforward to most of this audience. and coping capacities, both problem-focused coping and meaning-focused coping, which is what is most valuable if you're addressing a big problem that can't be resolved in one time but needs ongoing effort by yourself and others. Then interpersonal skills and relationships, cooperation and collaboration, because we are going to have a more community-oriented world, a zero-carbon world, and we also need to be cooperating in our way of addressing the climate emergency. We know that supportive relationships with parents, peers, and schools is a really important building block for this sort of resilience and helps support it. And then negotiation and conflict resolution. There's going to be lots of sources of conflict as we go through this crisis and through the transition. So teaching our kids nonviolent conflict resolution and negotiation skills is going to be really important. And then the social and civic mindedness, building community mindedness, a motivation to help work within your community, volunteering, being a joiner, the belief in that together you can make a difference, and active citizenship and global citizenship skills. And I would say that maybe these are more important than the STEM skills if our kids are going to survive what's ahead of them. Coming back to agency, I think agency is really important, and this is a graph by Back and colleagues which talks about the degrees of child agency or leadership, starting off with knowledge. I'm learning about disasters and how to stay safe. Voice, I'm speaking out on the risk. Protecting, I'm helping to protect my community. I'm helping to influence the way my community protects itself. Transform, I'm working to, and that's when it gets really interesting, I'm working to make my community less vulnerable in the future and to change policies that affect me, my community and my country. And of course, we all know that CROC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, quite explicitly says that kids have the right to speak out and be heard on factors that do affect their future, and there can't be any greater one than climate change. So on agency, of course, our best and action to transform, our best example is Drita Thumbburg, who only last year started the School Strike for Climate. And earlier this year at the World Economic Forum, she stared down the world leaders and says, I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear that I feel every day. And she, as I'm sure you all know, has stimulated so much and more action by young people around the world. So on the left here is Malou, who saw Greta on TV and said, I can do that. A shy little 14-year-old, got together with a few of her friends. And in no time, a very short time, we had 30,000 kids on the streets getting international coverage. So this is the coverage in the New York Times and around the world. And that then, of course, had led on to the even bigger strikes earlier on this year, in March this year, with what, 150,000 or so Australian kids on the streets. And they are so resourceful and determined and clever and articulate. It's really amazing. So I think this sign, activism is learning, is a really appropriate one when you listen to these kids and what they've learned about public speaking, about using the social media, about organizing and working together, about persisting, about being able to speak to politicians. They've learned a huge amount. And they're also very funny. I love this one, IKEA one. I think that's a terrific one. So I think this is really what we need to be supporting our kids to do, is to, as they have every right to have their voices heard about their future. So in conclusion then, I would say that the Earth is facing a dire predicament, and the challenges are massive and urgent, but we do have the capacity to slow and then stop the harmful warming of our planet, at the same time as building communities that are more fair and just and equitable and peaceful. And so solving the climate crisis is one of our best hopes for building a more peaceful world. But we're the only generation that can do it, which takes me back to the question that I started with asking myself at the start of all this: what's the point of working to improve child and youth well-being if there's not a livable planet for them. So I think for us as today's adults and people whose line of work shows their commitment to the next generation, we need to accept that their future survival of the young people, of the places we love, of our communities, depends on the actions we take now. So I think we must make this election a climate election, and we must push all the political parties into acceptance that there has to be a massive transformation, a whole of government change. So my thanks to my colleagues, particularly Susie Burke and Judith Van Horn, that I've done a lot of this thinking and talking and writing with, and to Jane Morton and the others at Darebin Climate Action Now, who are wonderful to work with, and many others. And now I will hand you back over to Paul.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you everyone who's stayed with us. We don't have any questions in, Anne, and I'll just fire up for a moment or two to see if any come in. But a really good presentation, very thorough, and I think you've sort of captured all the complexities. If this was simple, it would have been dealt with, and it hasn't, therefore it isn't. Like that sentence. And I think it's a great source of comfort to us all that we've seen, tens of thousands of kids hit the street. Clearly they're aware, clearly they're concerned enough to take action. They want to do something. But how do we as adults help young people? It's all great to get out in the streets and enjoy the momentum of the day and the excitement and the feeling of the feeling that you're taking steps. But frankly, until you get those young people running corporations and sitting around the cabinet table, not much is going to happen. How do we help young people steer that energy and anger from the street over the next 10 years into positions where how do we educate them? How do we steer them into political life, given how diminished political life seems to be? How untrusted our politicians are. It's a big question. Have you got any thoughts on how we turn that action in the streets into power in the boardroom?
Oh, well, I think that we certainly can't wait until these young people get to be controlling our parliaments and our corporations. We need to be acting now. So I think we need to be giving them as much support as we can in the actions that they're taking, and give them as much access to, help support them in getting access with business leaders, corporation leaders, politicians. And we can probably help with that because they speak with such passion and from the heart. They are very persuasive. So I think when a bunch of kids were speaking with Bill Shorten, I think fairly recently, and his advisors later said they're much more powerful than any of the lobbyists we've had here. So we can certainly do that, but we can't put the onus on them to do it. It's our responsibility to do it. We've created this mess and we ought to be fixing it up. So, there are so many policy changes that need to be made. We need to be, stopping all new coal mining. We all just need to be using both our capacity to withdraw funding, to withdraw support, to actually push for these changes happening now. We can't wait for 10 years and then say, let's start now. We need to be starting right now.
Yeah,
there are just very many ways where we as citizens need to act, and we as professionals, I think, can have really loud voices if we choose to use them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Racy strongly supports is the reduction of the voting age, for example, to 16, which I think for a lot of those young people who hit the streets would be very useful. But the other thing in relation to what the Bill Shorten's advisors said about the power of lobbyists, we need to be very realistic about that. Coal or anybody else have sway over politicians because they control votes. And
that's right.
And the only other, I guess, well, not the only, but a very important thing we can do as adults is change our consumer behaviour and set an example for others of our age and perhaps the young people to come. Because if we don't buy energy that's generated by coal, that's an excellent start. But
it is an excellent start, but but realistically, that's not going to be enough unless we're also, first of all, telling the coal company that that's what we're doing. I think another really important thing that we need to be pushing is for a just transition. There is going to be a lot of disruption if we're going to get on top of this, and we really need to be doing that forward planning for a just transition. So for people who are needing to move out of industries like the coal-powered fire generators, we really need to be working now on how they can transition to something more effective. My local council of Darebin is the first council in the world to declare a climate emergency, and they have, as a few other councils do, have got this really good solar saver program, which supports lower income people and even people who are renting to get solar panels and to get the reductions in their electricity bills through that, and to pay off the cost of the solar panels from their reductions in their energy bills. So there are all sorts of very clever things that we could be doing, as NGOs, as departments or whatever.
We've had a question.
To help push this along.
Thank you, Anne. We've had a question in, and it's a beauty, and I'll just put it to you on behalf of Katerina. She says, I'm interested in supporting early childhood educators to support children to be able to respond to the climate crisis. Do you have ideas about how we can support educators as well as parents, and obviously in the early childhood space?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question, Katerina, and I think that it is really important for us to be working with educators as well. And in early childhood, in general, we put quite a lot of focus on helping kids to fall in love with nature as being a really important precursor. So having things like bush kinders, I think, are great for that. Building that awareness of the natural world, and then building in awareness of how humans are negatively impacting on that and how they can address that. With supporting educators, I think there's a huge task in getting climate change into curricula at all levels. I think in Australia, we do fairly good on sustainability education. In secondary school, we do fairly well at teaching the science of climate change, but it often comes back to just sustainability behaviours as a response to it. So they might reduce their waste within the school, or encourage kids not to bring plastic packaging, to throw away packaging for their lunch or something. And I think we do have to go beyond that to also encouraging them to act politically in a whole range of ways, from the local through to the national level. And I think we can do that. So educators, I think, need to be supported in thinking about what kids' level of understanding of the environment is at this stage, and they're finding positive things to do that aren't building fear and anxiety, but are building that sense of efficacy. So I think there are a whole lot of approaches that educators can take within the early childhood setting, of being pro-environment and environmentally friendly, and having kids making, even then, a lot of kids even at that age, will do beautiful banners saying, I love this planet, look after this planet, I don't want, it's getting too hot in here, things like that. So kids can even start to think about their capacity to influence more broadly, even at that age. But I think that doing some curriculum development around this would also be really good. There are some resources there on the web.
As in everything with children, the earlier we start, the more impactful it is. Anne, thank you very much for that very comprehensive and topical and important presentation. For those on the line, we'll wrap it up now, but the presentation that Anne's given will be curated and put up on our website probably by the end of the week. And the slideshow will also be available, and we'd encourage people to be freely available. We'll also be putting it out on our social media channels, etc. We encourage anyone who wants to get involved in the first instance to pick up Anne's presentation and share it widely with your networks. So that will probably be up by Friday, and it'll be in our e-bulletin. You'll be able to pick up the link to it in our e-bulletin, which comes out every Friday. Next week, we will be having a final in this election series of webinars. Samantha Page will be joining us from Early Childhood Australia. Early Childhood Australia have done a pretty significant piece of work around how the various policies of the major parties stack up against, I think it's 7 election priorities which they've got. I think that'll be a very interesting talk and very important in the final 2 weeks of the campaign. So thank you again, Anne. Thank you everyone who attended. Please register for next week's final webinar with Samantha Page. All the recordings are available on our website, and you can obtain them through our weekly e-bulletins. So once again, thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye for now.
Thanks and bye.